On Afterwards this week, Dr. Paul Offit of the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and the author of You Bet Your Life, From Blood Transfusions to Mass Vaccination, the long and risky history of medical innovation. He argues that from the first blood transfusions 400 years ago to the hunt for a COVID-19 vaccine, risk has always been essential to the discovery of new treatments.
Well, how do we know it was effective? We knew it was effective because 16 children died of polio in that study, all in the placebo group. We knew it was effective because 36 children were paralyzed in that study, 34 in the placebo group. I mean, those were first and second graders in the 1950s. I was a first and second grader in the 1950s. But for the flip of a coin, those children could have lived long, fulfilling lives.
He's interviewed by Johns Hopkins University epidemiologist Dr. Emily Gurley. More after this.
Dr. Offit, I'm so happy to be talking with you today.
The pleasure's mine. Thank you very much.
Obviously, the themes in your book are very relevant for what we're going through today in the pandemic. And I know you said you started writing the book around the time the pandemic began, but can you tell us where the idea for the book came from and why this book now?
I think the emotion for this book actually came from the fact that I am a child of the 50s and I remember the polio epidemics. And what I remember from that is, one, how devastating and that pandemic or that yearly epidemic was, how much it affected my mother. You know, we were not allowed to go to, swim in a public pool. Me and my two first cousins would swim in these little plastic pools in the back. And so Jonas Salk made a polio vaccine, and he made it by taking the virus, growing it up, purifying it, and inactivating it with a chemical. So you were inoculated with whole killed polio virus. He tested it in 700 children in the Pittsburgh area, and he found it to be safe and induced an immune response that he felt comfortable would be protective. This is coming up now because I'm on the FDA's Vaccine Advisory Committee, and we are on Tuesday going to consider a several thousand child study for the 5 to 11-year-olds. So I'm getting to that in this context. And so he didn't want to, he was happy. He said, this is it, I've got it. Tells his wife, Donna, Eureka, I've got it. But nonetheless, the March of Dimes wanted to do a big study, and that broke his heart. He didn't want to do that. And he didn't want to inoculate children with a placebo vaccine during polio season. But nonetheless, that was what was done. So we had 420,000 children got Salk's vaccine, 200,000 children got placebo, and the vaccine was declared a year later by the person who headed that trial, safe, potent, and effective. And those three words were on the headline of every newspaper in the United States. Church bells rang out. Synagogues held special prayer meetings. Department stores stopped to announce that over the loudspeaker. It was over the Voice of America to all of Europe. At last, polio can be conquered. Well, how do we know it was effective? We knew it was effective because 16 children died of polio in that study, all in the placebo group. We knew it was effective because 36 children were paralyzed in that study, 34 in the placebo group. I mean, those were first and second graders in the 1950s. I was a first and second grader in the 1950s. But for the flip of a coin, those children could have lived long, fulfilling lives, but didn't. And I think that's something we don't ever realize, which is the human price that is invariably paid for knowledge. And it's coming up now with regard to these vaccines that we're going to be considering next Tuesday for the 5 to 11-year-olds.
Mm-hmm. I was reminded over and over again while reading your book just how grateful I am that I'm alive and raising kids now and not in the 50s or not in previous times where there were so many diseases that killed kids. In particular, the story about diphtheria and how it strangles kids is very compelling. Are there any diseases of the past that you would compare to COVID-19 in children?
Well, one would be polio. I mean, polio, like SARS-CoV-2, is largely an asymptomatic infection. Most children with polio had a mild intestinal illness. It was a summer intestinal virus. Only about 1 of every 200 people infected with polio, primarily children, would actually develop paralysis. So that's why it was so frightening. It was frightening because you didn't know who was shedding the virus. You didn't know who was contagious. So everybody, therefore, became a potential person from whom you could contract that virus. That's very similar to this virus. I mean, what made SARS-CoV-2 different than, say, SARS-1, which kind of raised its head in 2002, or MERS, which raised its head 10 years later, is that those viruses, when they infected you, caused you to have pretty severe illness. So you knew who was infected. So you could put a moat around those people, quarantine those people, and then effectively stop what was a potential pandemic. Not this virus. I mean, 50% of the people who get infected with this virus typically catch it from someone who never had symptoms, and that was polio. Same thing.
Okay. You also give many examples in the book of how things went wrong and how in the development of vaccines and therapeutics, and how those tragedies gave rise to new policies and new organizations within the U.S. government to ensure safety and efficacy of medical products. So where are we today in trust with those institutions? And if we've gone awry, which I think many would argue that we have, there are many who mistrust these organizations to keep our best interest at the forefront. Where do we go in restoring that trust?
I wish I had a clear answer for that. I think we are a cynical, litigious, sort of conspiracy theory laden society. We don't trust. I'm not sure where that break came. My argument would be probably sometime around Watergate, when you realize that behind that curtain, there were people who were saying things and doing things that weren't necessarily in our best interest. I think there was a sort of loss of innocence in some ways, certainly for me, associated with Watergate. But I mean, how do you regain that? I mean, to look at the current situation. I mean, look at the COVID pandemic. I mean, there was a vaccine. We isolated that virus, SARS-CoV-2 virus, in January of 2020 and sequenced it. So now you have the virus in hand. 11 months later, you had two large clinical trials with the Moderna vaccine or the Pfizer vaccine, 40,000 people, 30,000 people, showing the vaccine was remarkably effective, more effective than you would have ever imagined. I mean, 95% effective initially, and remarkably safe, but not absolutely effective and not absolutely safe. So then things move forward, right? Thousands of people get these vaccines, hundreds of thousands, millions, hundreds of millions get the vaccine. And then you find things out you wish you knew beforehand. You find out that the mRNA vaccines are a rare cause of myocarditis, inflammation of the heart muscle. You find that the Johnson & Johnson's vaccine, the vectored virus vaccine, is a very rare cause of something called thrombosis with thrombocytopenia syndrome, which means blood clots, including blood clots in the brain, which can be fatal. And there have been about a handful of people who have died as a consequence of the J&J vaccine. Now, so the point is you have systems in place now that can actually detect events as rare as that blood clotting phenomenon of the J&J vaccine, which is 1 per 500,000 people, or the myocarditis problem, which is 1 per 50,000 people. So these are extremely rare, and it's only because of those sort of tragedies in the past that led to these systems that allow us to monitor vaccines, in this case, post-approval. But again, I think you're right. I think we deal with an enormous level of distrust. It is remarkable to me that 65 million people in the United States continue to not get this vaccine, despite the fact that the evidence that it can save your life couldn't be clearer.
As someone in the scientific medical community, what do you think our role is in communicating to the public? And what advice would you give to other researchers about what they can do to play their part to promote trust in the system and make those systems trustworthy?
Yeah, I think the purpose for me in writing this book to let people know that you learn as you go. You always learn as you go. I mean, you're always sort of at some level building the airplane while it's in the air, and I feel like that's true now, and that has to be understood. But I think what happens, I mean, you could sort of read my book the other way, which is, that here's a series of tragedies which resulted in enormous amount of harm. And so, therefore, you can't trust science or you can't trust medicine. But that's the process. That is the process of knowledge. Knowledge is always hard-earned and invariably associated with a human price. And I think that has to be understood. And when people make a choice, they should realize there are no risk-free choices. There are just choices to take different risks. And so the goal then is to, in as dispassionate way as possible and as an informed way as possible, choose the lesser risk. And when people say, I don't want to get a vaccine, I don't want to risk getting a vaccine, well, they're risking getting this disease. And as an NIH researcher recently said, and I think he's absolutely right, over the next few years, you're going to have two choices, which is get vaccinated or get naturally infected. And natural infection is not the better choice. So I think that's the purpose of the book, to get people to understand that we learn as we go. Just going back to this meeting that I'm going to have with the FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee next Tuesday, we'll consider a trial in children 5 to 11 years of age of a few thousand children. And then we're about to make a recommendation for a few million children, tens of millions of children. When do you know everything? You never know everything. The question is, when do you know enough? When do you think you know enough to move forward? And that's really the history of medical advances. The fact is we live 30 years longer than we did 100 years ago. It's because of the 9 medical advances I talk about in this book, but they're hard-earned, and they will always be hard-earned. People would make the argument, you know what, let me wait till the learning curve is over, but the learning curve is really never over.
Well, and as you say in the book, we're always, day in and day out, making decisions in the face of uncertainty, whether we acknowledge it or not. I really liked your analogy of the 3 bridges to talk about the context of decision-making, or the decision-making in the context of uncertainties. Can you talk a little bit about the 3 bridges analogy?
Right. Well, I guess it's, let's suppose you have a certain disorder, and you want to try a therapy that is well tested. That it's well tested, and so you're willing then to walk over that bridge because you know that it's well tested. A sturdy bridge, you're good. But now the therapy is relatively new. It's a new therapy or a new biological whatever. Now do you want to do that? And the degree to which you want to do that is only to the degree that you're being chased by a lion. I mean, if you're chased by a lion, then you're willing to cross that more rickety, less tested bridge than if you're not being chased by a lion. It's actually Christian Barnard, who was the first person to do a human-to-human heart transplant, said that. I mean, the person who he transplanted, a man named Louis Washkansky, he was in desperate need of a heart. And, he was willing to be the first person to receive a human heart-to-heart transplant because he didn't have much longer to live. So the decisions get a little easier in that case. But, look at sort of the 4,000 people who are currently waiting for a heart transplant today. 1,300 of them will die while waiting. You don't know whether or not you're going to be one of those 1,300. So would you be willing to be one of the first or the first to try a pig heart, where pigs can be genetically engineered so that you won't reject the heart, so that you won't need immunosuppressive therapy? You want to try that? Now realize within the last 48 hours, there was a successful kidney transplant where the person who received the transplant received a transplant of a pig kidney, and it went well. So do you want to give that a shot? You want to try that? Or do you want to try the well-worn bridge, if you will, of getting a heart transplant, knowing that you'll live probably 15 years on average after that transplant? Or do you want to try the pig heart because you're scared you may be one of the 1,300 who dies while waiting? It's always, at some level, you're always gambling. And I just think what you said earlier was exactly right. We don't like to think we're ever dealing with uncertainty, but we always are.
We always are, and unfortunately, our human brains aren't well evolved to think about risk and that uncertainty. And when the pandemic first began, these examples you give are of individuals, right, making decisions about whether to take a new treatment or get the pig heart or wait and see if you are able to get a human heart transplant. Early in the pandemic, I think we were making those decisions more as a collective and a population. We needed to cross the bridge that may be uncertain, but there was a lion chasing us. How do you compare that individual patient decision-making about whether or not to take an intervention with the decisions that we were facing as a humanity early in the pandemic?
No, that's a great question. It's a perfect question. So for example, last September, October, the Kaiser Family Foundation did a polling of the United States citizens or Americans and asked the question, would you get a COVID-19 vaccine? This was before the vaccine came out. 30% said yes, they would. Now, if you'd asked me that question, I probably would have said no. Let me wait to see the data. I'm a skeptic. I think everybody who sits around the FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee table is a skeptic. Let's see the data. Okay, so now you've tested it in, let's say, the Pfizer vaccine in 40,000 adults. 40,000 adults have gotten this vaccine. It was 95% effective at preventing, really any illness, mild, moderate, or severe illness, and virtually 100% in preventing severe illness. Okay, so now that means 20,000 people, because it was a placebo-controlled study. 20,000 people have gotten the vaccine. 20,000. Do you want to be one of the first to get that vaccine, or do you want to wait until a few million doses are out there? I mean, the truth is, the father of modern vaccines, a man named Maurice Hilleman, who was either did the primary research or development on 9 of the 14 vaccines that we currently give to children, said it best. He said, quote, "I never breathe a sigh of relief until the first 3 million doses are out there, because sometimes you find out things you wish you'd known earlier." So do you want to wait? Do you want to wait till there's 3 million doses out there? In which case, you do risk getting an infection because the infection is so common. And this is what we've been there with the 12 to 15-year-old recommendation. Now we're going to have the 5 to 11-year-old recommendation. Do you want to wait? Do you want to wait until a few million children have been vaccinated, knowing that every week between 150,000 and 250,000 children are infected with this virus, that children account for more than a quarter of current infections as this Delta variant has reached down into that susceptible age group? 2,000 children are hospitalized every week, and about 600 children have died. I mean, I was on service last week at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. There were plenty of children in our intensive care unit who were suffering from this illness. So, do you want to wait or don't you? And I think this is do you want to wait till more in the population are vaccinated, or do you want to get the vaccine, knowing that the few thousand children that were tested in that 5 to 11-year-old study by Pfizer is enough? When do you know enough to move forward? And it's a hard question to answer. And you only really know the answer in retrospect.
Right. Exactly. And there are some examples of particularly treatments for COVID-19 that received emergency use authorization early on. Hydroxychloroquine and convalescent plasma therapy are 2 examples that were used. And, now we know, well, they don't work and may even cause harm in some patients. And looking back on those decisions early in the pandemic, how critical should we be, knowing that they were making decisions in the face of uncertainty? How critical should we be in that retrospective analysis, knowing what we know today?
Frankly, even prospectively, those were bad decisions. I mean, I really do feel like the FDA was not at its best during that time. I think they really succumbed to what was a lot of arm twisting by the administration. That was an administration that was looking for a magic medicine. The hydroxychloroquine had never been shown to work to either treat or prevent this illness. Convalescent plasma data were very weak. And, when you had sort of the FDA commissioner standing up in front of the American public and saying 35 out of every 100 people who is infected with this virus will have their life saved by convalescent plasma, I don't know what data he was looking at, because that certainly wasn't the data that were available. So I think that was awful, and it scared me, frankly. I mean, when I actually, with Dr. Ezekiel Emanuel, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, basically fearing the sort of October surprise as we headed to the November 3rd election last year. I mean, I was afraid that sort of the administration would reach its hand into Operation Warp Speed, pull out a couple of vaccines that hadn't finished phase 3 trials, especially the 2 months after last dose, to make sure there was no safety problem. And if you were going to do that, if you were going to go 2 months after the last dose, that was going to take you beyond the election date. But fortunately that did happen, and I think the FDA did stand up there, and since then it's been a lot better. But what's so hard about this is that you are making decisions with far fewer data than you normally would, because we're in the middle of a pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you mentioned there the encroachment of politics into medical science and public health, and clearly some negative examples. Can you think historically of any good examples of politics interfering in science and public health? Are there good examples out there?
Well, I guess what I would say, a good example is actually, let's go back to the Trump administration. I think the decision to put $24 billion into this effort, I think the name Operation Warp Speed, I think was not the best choice. I think it kind of scared people that, that safety guidelines were being ignored or timelines were being crunched. But that what they did there was they basically mass produced the vaccine at risk, meaning that they didn't wait for finishing of the phase 3 trials to see whether the vaccine worked, to see whether it was safe. They built the building, they mass produced the vaccine, and if it didn't work or was unsafe, they were just going to throw the vaccine away. But this way, when you saw that the trials were successful, you could roll it right off the shelves. And I think that was an example of the government taking over a program that was great. On the other hand, if you want to see the government on the other side, it would be the swine flu vaccine story in 1976. I mean, there was an outbreak of basically H1N1 influenza, so-called swine flu influenza, in Fort Dix, around that time, and at Fort Dix, New Jersey, and the thinking was this could be a pandemic strain, but it wasn't. There was enough information probably that probably wouldn't be. There were a lot of advisors that told President Ford, don't launch this program, but he did. I mean, the government basically paid for that vaccine. It was a short-lived program. Probably 40 million people got that vaccine. It was found to have an unfortunate side effect called Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is an ascending paralysis that can be severe. It was rare, maybe 1 per 100,000 people, but it was real. That was a program that was disastrous in many ways.
What do you think about the politics at an international scale around the pandemic and particularly vaccines? What has worked in your opinion, and what should we avoid next time?
Well, it's interesting, the level of nationalism, isn't it? I mean, so China has a vaccine made by Sinopharm, which is this whole inactivated viral vaccine. That's their strategy. And so people in China get that vaccine, and people who are allies of China get that vaccine. Russia has a vaccine similar to the AstraZeneca vaccine and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which is a so-called vectored virus vaccine. It's sort of two doses of that, and that's what you get if you're in Russia. The AstraZeneca vaccine was primarily a United Kingdom vaccine and some other European countries for that. Here, the Moderna vaccine is a U.S. vaccine. I mean, the research for that vaccine was done at the National Institutes of Health. Moderna is a U.S. company, and so that's a U.S. product. So it's interesting how it's played out. Definitely there's a nationalism here. I talk about that a little bit with anesthesia. In the chloroform was a European invented phenomenon, and even though it was actually much more dangerous than two other anesthetic agents, ether and nitrous oxide, it was sort of perpetuated in Europe much longer, I think, because there was this kind of nationalistic sense of pride that they were the ones who'd invented it.
Do you think that nationalist sense of pride is also driving vaccine use? I mean, I imagine so, right? Even though some of these vaccines work better than others, it seems that countries who have developed vaccines are sticking with theirs.
It certainly seems that way. Yes, I completely agree. It's interesting. And you would think it wouldn't necessarily be that way. I mean, so for example, if the vaccine in China, the whole inactivated viral vaccine were better, I mean, would we use that vaccine to the exclusion of, say, the Pfizer or Moderna or Johnson & Johnson vaccine? It's not clearly better. So that didn't happen. But had it been that way, would we have been different? Or in China, if you look at for example, the Moderna or Pfizer vaccines as compared to the vaccine, the whole inactivated vaccine used in China, it looks like it's better than that vaccine. Nonetheless, they're using their vaccine.
Well, and perhaps at this stage in the game where vaccine supplies are still fairly constrained, maybe there isn't much choice there, but maybe things will shift once that's no longer such an issue.
No, I think you're right. And certainly this virus is going to be with us for a while. And as more and more vaccines come into play, the New England Journal of Medicine just this past few weeks has a Novavax vaccine, which is a sort of purified protein that's adjuvanted with a powerful adjuvant. And, it was roughly 90% effective, including those who are over 65 years of age. And we'll see how that plays out. I think what's going to happen over time is as you have more and more experience with this vaccine, now about 1 billion people have been vaccinated in this world of more than 7 billion people. I think you're going to find out that there may be differences in the safety profiles, or there will be differences in the safety profiles. There'll be differences in the capacity of these different vaccines to protect against different variants as more and more variants arise. There'll be differences in the capacity for duration of immunity. And so I think we're going to learn as we go, and then we'll see how it plays out at an international level.
I'm sure we'll be learning a lot more. There's no doubt. So we talk about these vaccines that work. And as you already mentioned, I think we got so lucky. Okay? There was no reason to believe that we would have such safe, effective vaccines. But when we talk about vaccines in the media and the general population in lay terms, we talk about how well vaccines work. But of course, scientists don't measure whether or not vaccines work. We measure efficacy, safety, immunogenicity, effectiveness. Does it prevent infection? Does a vaccine prevent infectiousness? Does it prevent hospitalization? Any disease? Does it prevent death? Does it prevent sequelae? So we have all a myriad of outcomes that we think about with vaccines, yet it gets distilled into this general concept of whether or not the vaccine works. So there's a lot of nuance lost there. Should we be concerned about that loss of nuance? And if so, why?
So it's been interesting to see the way this is played. I mean, I was fortunate enough to be part of a team at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia that created the strains that became the rotavirus vaccine. So that was a 26-year effort. I certainly got to watch that vaccine go from bench to bedside. And I'm only all too grateful that the people who are communicating that vaccine are not the people who are communicating about this vaccine. I mean, I think there have been at least 3 major communication errors with this vaccine in terms of what you're getting at. I think the first is the use of the term breakthrough. If you're given a vaccine and you have a mildly symptomatic infection or an asymptomatic infection, you won. That's the goal of this vaccine. The goal of this vaccine is to protect against serious illness, meaning the kind that causes you to seek medical attention or go to the hospital or go to the ICU. That's the goal. It's the rare vaccine that prevents asymptomatic infection or even mildly symptomatic infection. So when Brett Kavanaugh, for example, who's fully vaccinated, has an asymptomatic infection, that's carried as a breakthrough. And the word breakthrough implies failure. And so I think it sort of damns this vaccine unfairly. I think the second major communication error, and it really both those occurred at the same time, which is associated with that Provincetown outbreak in eastern Massachusetts. Thousands of men get together, celebrate July 4th. 80% of them were vaccinated. Nonetheless, there's an outbreak involving 346 people, most of whom had asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic infection, which was sadly termed a breakthrough. 4 were hospitalized. In other words, a hospitalization rate of 1.2%. That's excellent. That's as good as you're going to do with the vaccine. Nonetheless, it was carried as, breakthrough. Now, hospitalizations, that is a breakthrough illness, but, the mild infections weren't. The third communication error, I think, was when President Biden stood up at the podium in August and said, we are going to have a booster dose available for all Americans over 18 years of age on September 20th, thus sending the message that people, for example, who'd gotten 2 doses of mRNA vaccine or 1 dose of J&J's vaccine were not fully immunized. So I think we have an excellent vaccine that continues to have excellent protection against serious disease, including Delta variant, including all age groups, right up to the present time. But you would never know it by the way it's communicated, because everybody is scurrying to get this sort of cash in on this booster palooza that we've created, where I think we've scared people. We've created this kind of third dose fever. And if we really want to get on top of this pandemic, that's not the issue. I can tell you that at the hospital of the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, when adults come into our hospital and are in the intensive care unit, it's not because they haven't gotten a third dose. It's because they haven't gotten any doses. And until we get on top of that, we're not going to really, I think, have a major impact on this pandemic.
I share your perspective on those issues. And, I think sometimes it's hard to pull back and see the forest from the trees. But if a new disease emerged today that had the hospitalization and mortality rate of vaccinated people, we would not have shut the world down for that. So I think those are important messages for getting back to a post-pandemic world. So I want to ask you about your experience living in this pandemic where everyone is interested in vaccines, and more people, I'm sure, well, I would guess, consider themselves to be experts in vaccines. There was a meme going around early on that entertained me about the armchair epidemiologist in the pandemic. Did you have the same phenomena of armchair vaccinologists, and are you familiar with that concept?
Yes, I certainly am. I mean, it is certainly an odd time. I mean, I'm a virologist and immunologist, although trained as a pediatrician, and suddenly, I'm on television, all the time. I mean, which to me means if a virologist is asked to be on television a lot, it's probably a sign of the apocalypse, the way I see it. But it's just so weird, actually, that sort of that take our committee, our FDA's Vaccine Advisory Committee. I mean, when I came onto that committee 4 years ago, we're the people that pick the flu strains every year. So March we pick the flu strains for September, right? It's a 6-month production cycle. It's just a group of nerdy virologists sitting around talking about what flu strains are circulating. Nobody's in the audience. Certainly, it's not being televised on C-SPAN. Nobody's asking us for our opinion afterwards. It's never breaking news. It was great. And now suddenly, you're in the spotlight. All these sort of FDA vaccine advisors are in the spotlight. It's just odd. But you're right. In terms of the armchair epidemiologist or the armchair virologist, I certainly get a lot of emails from people telling me how awfully wrong I am about whatever it is I've most recently said.
Yeah, there's a lot of people in that club. What do you wish that the armchair virologists out there knew? What do they most often get wrong?
I think the thing that's hardest for people to grasp, and you sort of alluded to it earlier, is the notion of relative risk. I don't think we get that. It's hard to communicate risk. I mean, so for example, the risk of myocarditis is 1 in 50,000. The risk of Guillain-Barré syndrome after J&J's vaccine is 1 in 120,000. I mean, the risk of severe clotting is 1 in 500,000. These are extraordinarily rare events. Nonetheless, you can see people sort of making policy decisions based on these rare risks. There's not a vaccine I can think of that doesn't have a rare, serious risk. They all do. I mean, measles vaccine can cause thrombocytopenia, a lowering of the platelet count associated with bleeding in roughly 1 in 30,000 people. The oral polio vaccine was a rare cause of polio. It occurred in 1 per 2.4 million doses. The influenza vaccine is a rare cause of Guillain-Barré syndrome, 1 per million doses. But we don't make policy based on that. And I think that's the thing that's the hardest for me to watch. We so struggle with trying to communicate relative risk because it's people don't look at it that way. Just as you said earlier, our brains are just not constructed for that. I think the problem is when we crawled out of ocean onto land, assuming, we all believe in evolution, that our amygdala and hippocampus were far better developed than our cerebrum, which came late to the game, frankly, too late to the game. When New York State Lottery wants to sell its tickets, for a 14 million to 1 shot, it does it with a simple phrase. It could happen to you. And I think that's the way people see these rare adverse events.
Yeah, right. Well, yeah, I think if we evolved with an excellent sense of relative risk, we probably wouldn't need formal training in fields like epidemiology, would we? That would just come built in.
Right.
Yeah.
Would that were true. I think at the very least we could probably be better about educating about the scientific method, how it works at the elementary school level. I mean, I remember as a child, Mr. Wizard. See, this is well before your time, but Mr. Wizard was a guy who, on my black and white television set in the 1950s and 1960s, he would always be standing next to like 10, 11, 12-year-old child who he would then explain various scientific concepts like a vacuum, how you could create a vacuum by putting in a milk bottle, a flame, and then that would suck like a soft-boiled egg into the bottle. And he used flashing lights to represent radiation. And you could be a member of the Mr. Wizard Science Club, which meant that you got a little kit and you got his books, and it was great. I don't know of anything analogous to that today. It would be, science was in many ways celebrated. And there was certainly far more time devoted to science and technology on television then or even in the newspapers then than there is now. I think obviously the pandemic changes that largely, but I think we need to be better educated about the scientific method and how that works. So science is, I think, losing its place as a source of truth. It's becoming just another voice in the room.
Sadly, I think you're probably right. But maybe we can use the pandemic as a way to re-engage young minds in science and the scientific endeavor. And I know I've definitely gotten more emails lately from high schoolers who are interested in careers in science. So we can hope, I guess, that maybe that's one good thing that comes out of this.
We can always hope. I am impressed by the young, though. I mean, I've done a number of sort of webcasts or podcasts, with a variety of, people in their late teens, early 20s, and they're just really, really interested in getting it right. It is encouraging. So I'm choosing to take heart in that.
Like we have to find victories, recognize them where we find them, at least. So I want to get back to the concept of risk. And, I think there are some people who have been living for quite some time that, in ways, believing that the pandemic is over. Like there's nothing about this pandemic that's going to have a major impact on their life. There are some people even today who can never imagine the end to the pandemic or going back to what they did before out of fear. I would guess you're somewhere in between. Can you tell us a little bit about how you think about the end of the pandemic? What are the signposts that we should be looking for, based on the evidence, based on science, on when the pandemic will be over, knowing that COVID will go away, but at some point will become a manageable endemic disease? What do you think? What do you think about when the pandemic ends?
So I think you're right. I think it's the pandemic part will end hopefully relatively soon in the United States. Remembering that we are only as good as the world as we learn from this pandemic, right? I mean, what happened in China clearly affected the rest of the world. In terms of herd immunity, I mean, what percentage of the population needs to be protected either from vaccination or natural infection to significantly slow the spread of this virus? That's actually based on two factors. One is the contagiousness of the virus, the so-called R0 or contagiousness index, which is somewhere between 5 and 9, meaning if I'm infected and I go out into the world and see everybody I come in contact with is susceptible, I'll infect 5 to 9 more people. And then the second thing is vaccine effectiveness, but it's really effectiveness against contagiousness. So if you sort of plug things into the formula based on those two factors, it's actually R0 minus 1 over R0 divided by effectiveness. You're probably in at least the low to mid 90% range for what you need to have in terms of protection. It's really almost close to what you see with measles vaccine. You need to be in the low to mid 90% range. We're probably right now at about 75%. I mean, although about 57% of the U.S. is fully vaccinated, there's at least 100 million people who've been naturally infected, and there's overlap between those two groups. But I think we're probably at 75, maybe 80% now. We are starting to see numbers come down, but that's happened before, so it's hard to take too much heart in this. But I think if we can vaccinate another 30 million people, I really do think we can get on top of this. But you're right. This virus isn't going away for a while. And as long as it exists in the world, we need to make sure we're a highly protected population. I mean, look at the polio vaccine. We still give children a polio vaccine every year in this country. We haven't had polio in this country since the 1970s. We haven't had polio in this country for 50 years. Why do we do it? We do it because polio still exists in the world. And I think that came to sort of light in our hospital recently when we were taking in children from Afghanistan. I mean, Afghanistan polio is still endemic. And so now suddenly our residents and interns are thinking, wait, could this person be shedding polio virus asymptomatically? Suddenly they're thinking about polio where they hadn't thought about it before. It sort of brought it into stark contrast. Yeah,
we have the luxury of not thinking about polio very much these days, don't we? At least in the U.S.
Right.
So I wanted to turn to another recurring theme in your book. I really enjoyed the stories about the people and their humanity, their human fragility, both the patients that you describe in many of the vignettes, as well as the scientists themselves. And you talk in particular about some scientists who had really severe moral failings and how that was their scientific contributions were marred by their human failings. And in today's society where we're all judged increasingly. I think, we know more about each other's personal lives than ever before. What role should there be for, when evaluating a scientific discovery, the person themselves and their personal lives? How should we wrestle with those in a reasonable, productive way?
Right. That's a great question. When you publish a scientific paper, there's always a certain level of trust. You assume that the person isn't making up data. The way that gets ferreted out, if you will, is that it has to be reproducible. Other people working in different parts of the world, working with different populations of people, if it's a clinical study, then show the same thing, and then a truth emerges. But you're right. I mean, the scientific process is flawed in the sense that it's a human endeavor and humans are flawed. So you have to have those sort of that kind of truths emerge thing associated with other people doing it. But one thing I think that was important for me in writing the book is you can't really legislate it away. I mean, you can put as many sort of systems in place to make sure that things don't happen, but they always happen. I mean, for me, one of the most emotional stories, because I lived it, was the Jesse Gelsinger story. I mean, just because that happened at Penn, and I was at Wistar actually when that was all happening. So Jesse Gelsinger was a 19-year-old man who had a enzyme deficiency, one liver enzyme he was lacking, which made it much more difficult for him to convert food into energy. So he had to take as many as 30 pills every day. But it was just one gene. So he would be uniquely susceptible to being cured by gene therapy. And so the gene therapy that was used was actually very similar to like the J&J or AstraZeneca vaccine. It was a replication defective adenovirus. So an adenovirus is a common cold virus. You can render it so it can't reproduce itself, and then you can put the gene in it that this boy lacked. And he was given that product, that gene, as part of an experiment. And he had essentially like a sepsis-like syndrome where his immune system was sort of overreacted and his blood pressure dropped and he basically died of what looked like bacterial sepsis, but it was really an overactive immune response and nobody knew why that was. And eventually they did figure it out and that it was one particular protein of his immune system that sort of overwhelmed him. And with that, then the so-called CAR T therapy, where you can take someone's T cells, which is a kind of immunological cell, out of their body and engineer it so it can kill cancer cells. I mean, this is also another Penn phenomenon. This girl named Emily Whitehead, received that therapy and she had the same symptoms that he had, Jesse Gelsinger, except this time you knew what had happened to Jesse Gelsinger. This time you had a monoclonal antibody that could neutralize that so-called interleukin-6 protein that had gone out of control. And so out of that Gelsinger tragedy came this remarkable story of Emily Whitehead, who would eventually visit the White House and take pictures with Obama, and her picture was everywhere. Jesse Gelsinger's wasn't. I mean, we obviously celebrate our victories, not our failures, but because of Jesse Gelsinger, we learned much. And so there were so many things put in place after Gelsinger's death, sort of legislatively, to try and prevent it from happening again. But it did happen again, with the retrovirus, so-called gene therapy that was used in France, where this particular virus happened to insert itself right in front of a gene that increased your risk for leukemia. And 4 of 10 children in that study got leukemia. So you always learn, and there's always at some level tragedy in that knowledge. And I just think at some level people need to know this. And although it is so hard to accept that, obviously, you'd like to think we know everything, but we never know everything.
Humility has got to stay front and center in all of these endeavors.
That's exactly the right word, by the way. That is exactly the right word. Humility. I mean, when we were at the beginning of this pandemic, and some of the CEOs of Pfizer and Moderna and others said, after they'd done a phase 1 trial of 10 or 15 people, then started talking about how they could mass produce millions of doses, you're just shuddering, thinking, be humble. Nature gives its secrets up slowly, grudgingly, and invariably with a human cost. Be humble. That's where that struck me. But you're right. Humility is the word.
Yeah, I mean, it's just key, and it's hard for me to imagine not being humble in the face of all this. I really appreciated that point that you made. Another cognitive bias that you highlighted. I can't remember if it was that story or another in the book, but I think it's commonly referred to as the outcome bias, where we judge a process based on the outcome. So if the outcome is good, we assume the process was good. The outcome's bad, we assume the process was bad or inherently flawed, which isn't always the case. And I think the example that you just gave is highlights that to some extent. What are some of that outcome bias? Where do you see that happening now in the pandemic, if at all?
Right. So the question is to be made wise by your experiences and not just nervous by them. I think that, the first antibiotic that was developed, so-called sulfanilamide, it was a product of the German dye industry in the 1930s. It was a breakthrough product. It could treat meningitis. Now you could treat pneumonia. You could treat gonorrhea. You could treat a whole broad spectrum of bacteria because of this amazing drug, sulfanilamide. And so it was available as a powder or a tablet form, but it wasn't easily ingested by children because they're not so good at taking tablets or powder. So one company, the Massengill company of Bristol, Tennessee, resuspended that product in diethylene glycol, which was palatable and certainly solubilized this particular drug. The problem was diethylene glycol was fatal to kidneys. It really caused enormous kidney damage. And when this product was then released, there was like 240 gallons of it that were released. 100 people died, 34 of whom were children, and it really froze people about this drug. But what they didn't understand initially, it wasn't the drug. It was the way in which the drug was suspended. And so there were people then early on that said, I'm not going to take that drug because the drug could kill people, whereas it wasn't the drug. And, and the same thing with like diphtheria antitoxin. There was and by the way, that elixir sulfanilamide disaster led to the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, or as historian Michael Harris has famously said, drug regulation in the United States is built on tombstones. And that's always true. And it was true with this sort of tetanus disaster in the early 1900s, where diphtheria antisera, which was generated in horses, would save children's lives who had diphtheria. But this particular horse was infected with tetanus, so he had tetanus toxin in his bloodstream. And so 13 children in St. Louis died of tetanus when they were given a diphtheria antisera to treat their diphtheria. And many people then stopped giving diphtheria antisera and then watched children die of diphtheria because they were scared of the antisera. So, but the lesson is that we shouldn't, take antisera from horses that have tetanus. And, but it's odd the way we take the wrong lesson sometimes, because you can fix the problem.
Right. Exactly. And thinking about, the discussion about antibiotics and just how revolutionary they were in saving lives, the advancements in anesthesiology and anesthetics. You talk about, how many people now remember the days of when you had to undergo surgery without anesthesia. We're a pretty pampered people these days. I think sometimes we forget. And so these were major advancements that improve the longevity and quality of human lives. But of course, there are downsides even to those, right? These are all tools, and we see now antimicrobial resistance, threatening human health. The real crisis in opioid addiction, people who were treated for pain and then became reliant on those drugs and suffer as a consequence. It's a reminder, isn't it, that these are tools. They can be used for good, but there's always some possible downside.
Right, and you have to be careful how you use them. You bring up the issue of antibiotic resistance. I remember when I was in high school, I read a book by Sinclair Lewis called Arrowsmith. That book was written in the 1920s. And in that book, Martin Arrowsmith, a doctor, is working with bacteriophage therapy. So bacteriophages are viruses that can enter bacteria and kill them. So, bacteriophage, phage means eat. So these viruses could actually kill bacteria because that's all you had. It was the 1920s. There weren't antibiotics yet. Well, we use bacteriophage therapy now at Children's Hospital Philadelphia in certain children who are infected, say, with strains of Pseudomonas that are completely resistant to antibiotics. And mostly you see that in patients with cystic fibrosis. And that's because we now have overused antibiotics, used them injudiciously, and now we have children who are constantly requiring antibiotics who are infected with bacteria that are resistant to all commercially available antibiotics. And so what do? We do bacteriophage therapy. It's like back to where we were 100 years ago on this.
What's old is new again. So I'm sure you're aware of these efforts. Even before the pandemic, there was a lot of discussion about how to better prepare for emerging infectious diseases, particularly in terms of developing vaccines. I think the outbreak of Ebola in West Africa was a good example of how we had vaccines that seemed to work well in animal models, but had never been trialed in humans. And so when we were faced with a large outbreak, we had possible tools, but they really weren't developed well enough to be used in people. And that's for a good reason. Usually we don't invest in vaccines unless we can see a way through to getting them licensed, which means knowing when and where people are going to get sick so we can design trials. And so there's a push now to change that paradigm and to try to develop vaccine candidates, therapeutics as well, for some of these emerging infections. And well, I think because of that, even some of the COVID vaccine, the COVID-19 vaccines that we have were, already in development because of this new push. But it seems a different endeavor to start testing vaccines in humans for diseases that aren't common, and engaging people in discussions about participating in those trials, even if they may not personally be at risk for those diseases now. I'm a big proponent of that, and I think we can gain a lot by doing that kind of research. But I wondered your thoughts on this new paradigm shift in vaccine development.
No, I think it's actually, what amazes me is that when faced with this pandemic, the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, that what we ended up going to in this country were two novel technologies. I mean, for as much experience as we've had with live attenuated viral vaccines or whole killed viral vaccines or purified protein viral vaccines, like the hepatitis B or human papillomavirus vaccine, what we went to were the mRNA, was either mRNA or these vectored virus and these genetic vaccines. And the reason is, in many ways, they were much easier to do because you just needed that one gene. You didn't, it was in many ways easier because you knew the gene you were interested in. You were interested in the gene that coded for the surface protein. So in many ways, they were the fastest vaccines to make, easier than the others. I mean, so I think that sort of surprised me. But I think what really surprised me negatively was how bad we were at handling this pandemic initially, just with these simple things like making sure that we could have adequate testing and adequate quarantining and masking and social distancing, the kind of things that could have gotten us under much better control of this pandemic, as was true in China or true in South Korea or true in Japan or true in Australia. I mean, we were one of the worst countries. I mean, we have, 4% of the world's population and about 20% of the world's deaths. It surprised me. I wouldn't have imagined we would have been as technologically advanced as we are to have done that. It's just, we always claim this sort of American exceptionalism, but we were far from exceptional there.
What do you, I think we'll see how we end up with mortality totals globally. I think we do sometimes fall prey to these comparisons because we're actually better at identifying deaths than a lot of other places, and we're maybe more transparent about reporting them. So there could be some of that in there. Mm-hmm. But you're right. I think that there was, obviously initially some reluctance to engage and take action. And many of the countries that you just mentioned who were on the ball maybe did a much better job at those initial public health interventions, had a lot more previous experience with emerging diseases and outbreaks than we have. I mean, when was the last time the average American had their life impacted by an emerging infection? It's probably been some time.
Right. Well, the 2009 swine flu pandemic was expected to be, frankly, much harder hitting than it was in this country. We didn't have nearly as many deaths as we had anticipated. But I think we also suffer from the fact that we have sort of like 50 different governments. Each state is sort of its own government, which makes it hard to have kind of national policies, I think, or at least it seemed to.
Absolutely. Whenever we talk about the response in the U.S., it's always a patchwork, right? It's really hard to make generalizations, except to say that it's so complex. I absolutely agree. You are a prolific author and have so much experience communicating what you do every day to a lay audience. And some of these really key, important medical and scientific discoveries. What advice would you have for others who may be interested in writing a book? Would you advise it? And what advice would you have on being successful?
Sure. I mean, I enjoy writing, so it's fun for me to do that. I think if you want to write a book, probably the best thing you can do is have your idea, write an outline for what that idea is, come up with a proposal. Then when you have your proposal, the best thing is to find an agent who can represent your book, and it's easy to find a whole list of them. The so-called literary marketplace is a book, and now it's online. And then find someone who's in line with your way of thinking, and then see if you can get a publisher. But that's not the way I did it initially. The first book I wrote that was at least narrative nonfiction was a book called The Cutter Incident, which went through this horrible tragedy that occurred with the polio vaccine. And I wrote the book, and then I wrote a proposal, and then I got an agent. So because I didn't want anybody to tell me not to write it. That was the thing. So I don't recommend that. And if you're going to try and communicate science to the public, do it on long format shows like this. I mean, I was on John King's show, Inside Politics at noon. And, there you have, at most, you have 4 minutes to try and educate people about difficult scientific concepts. I mean, imagine I was part of a 2-day booster meeting, last week or so ago at the FDA. And then I listened to the Advisory Committee for Immunizations Practices. So here you have like hours and hours of slides and discussions because get that down to about 2 minutes. It's just hard. It's really hard to do it. But these kinds of programs are great because you get to develop themes. I'm
a big proponent of long form conversations as well. I've never been good at getting a point across in 4 minutes, so I'm sympathetic. Yeah. I really enjoyed the conversation today, so thanks so much for embarking on this long form conversation.
Thank you. It was fun. I really enjoyed it. Thanks so much.
Yeah, and thanks again for all of your wisdom and sharing these stories from our history. They're especially pertinent today and really great reminders of what we have ahead of us, honestly, with vaccines and therapies for COVID.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast. C-SPAN has a new podcast, About Books. Each episode delves into news about the nonfiction book publishing industry with publishing experts and insiders. You'll also hear reports on the latest nonfiction bestsellers, trends, and book reviews. About Books. Find it wherever you get your podcasts.